Hi, I'm Joe Graydon.
I'm Terry Graydon. Welcome to this podcast of the People's Pharmacy, where we bring you the stories behind the health headlines.
This podcast is brought to you by Redix Industries, makers of Utterly Smooth Body Cream. 800-345-7339, on the web at uttercream.com. Many people take a handful of pills every day for blood pressure, cholesterol, or diabetes. What happens if they interact? This is the People's Pharmacy with Terry and Joe Graydon.
Most people assume that their medicines are both safe and effective, but every drug comes with the potential for causing adverse reactions. Today we talk with Dr. Russ Altman of Stanford University Medical School.
Whenever we use a medication, there should never be an assumption that it's 100% safe and nothing bad could happen.
A recent study by the Chicago Tribune found that over half of the 255 pharmacies surveyed dispensed deadly drug combinations without any warnings. How can you protect yourself?
Coming up on the People's Pharmacy, learn about hazardous drug interactions.
First, the news.
In the People's Pharmacy health headlines, regular use of pain relievers like ibuprofen or naproxen might increase a woman's risk of hearing loss. That's the finding from analyzing more than 6 years of data from the Nurses' Health Study. In this research, almost 56,000 women answered questions about their use of over-the-counter pain relievers. Those who used a nonsteroidal anti-inflammatory drug or acetaminophen at least twice a week had a 9 to 10% increased chance of developing hearing loss. There was no connection between hearing and aspirin use. A 10% increase in risk is pretty modest, but considering how many people use an NSAID on a regular basis, it could still end up with a lot of people straining to hear.
Eating foods rich in magnesium can help protect people from many chronic conditions. Researchers looked at data from 40 different studies in 9 countries. In these observational studies, those who ate the most magnesium-rich foods, such as leafy greens, nuts, whole grains, and fish, had lower rates of heart disease, stroke, and diabetes than those who ate the fewest such foods. The investigators found that an additional 100 milligrams a day of magnesium didn't seem to make a difference for heart attacks, but it reduced the risk of heart failure by 22%. The chance of a stroke dropped by 7%. This much increase in magnesium consumption lowered the likelihood of diabetes by 19% and reduced death from any cause by 10%. Actually, because the studies were not experimental trials, no cause and effect relationship can be established. The findings do suggest, however, that eating more magnesium-rich foods may have substantial health benefits.
You don't have to live near the Mediterranean Sea to get benefit from a Mediterranean-style diet. A new study of 967 older Scots found that those consuming more fruits, vegetables, olive oil, beans, fish, and whole grains had the least brain shrinkage over 3 years. In the study, 562 people without dementia went through MRI imaging of the brain when they were 73 years old. 400 of them had a second MRI scan 3 years later when they were 76. Those whose dietary patterns did not follow the Mediterranean diet recommendations had a greater loss of brain volume in those 3 years. Fish and meat consumption was not correlated to changes in brain volume. This study wasn't able to determine which component of the Mediterranean diet is most protective, or whether the whole combination of fresh produce and olive oil is required. It also did not establish a causal connection, as it was not a randomized trial. It does suggest, however, that the cardiovascular and metabolic benefits from the Mediterranean diet can also give the brain a boost.
Adults who love sausage, bacon, ham, prosciutto, pepperoni, pastrami, and other cured meats could be setting themselves up for wheezing, according to a study from France. In this research, dietary data were collected from 971 participants from several French cities. Asthma symptoms were also tracked. People who ate at least 4 servings of cured meats weekly were 76% more likely to have worsening asthma symptoms than those who ate less than 1 serving a week. The nitrite preservatives found in these products may contribute to oxidative stress and inflammation. The authors conclude that cured meats have a deleterious effect on asthma and point out that dietary factors can influence lung function.
A meta-analysis involving 20 randomized controlled trials found that probiotics reduce a key marker of inflammation, known as C-reactive protein. Elevated levels of CRP are associated with a greater risk for metabolic syndrome, type 2 diabetes, and cardiovascular disease. When people take probiotic bacteria such as lactobacillus and bifidobacteria, whether in pills or as yogurt, this inflammatory compound drops. This may reflect a healthier microbiome within the digestive tract. Probiotics may also improve the barrier function of the intestinal lining, thereby enhancing the immune system and reducing inflammation. And that's the health news from the People's Pharmacy this week.
Welcome to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. According to the FDA, adverse drug reactions are a leading cause of death in America, right after heart attacks, cancer, and respiratory diseases. Deadly drug interactions are a big part of the problem.
To help us better understand the problem of drug incompatibility, we turn to Dr. Russ Altman. He's the Kenneth Fong Professor of Bioengineering, Genetics, Medicine, and Biomedical Data Science at Stanford University Medical School.
Welcome to the People's Pharmacy, Dr. Russ Altman.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's good to be speaking with you today.
And thank you, Dr. Altman. I guess the first question has to do with how many medicines do Americans take in any given day, any given week, any given year? It seems like, you look at those commercials on television and there's a prescription drug ad almost every 10 minutes or maybe more. And so we must be a nation of pill takers.
We really are. It usually starts slow with many of our 20-year-olds on nothing, if they're fortunate, and even 30 and 40-year-olds. But as we age and we have more and more contact with the medical system, I'm afraid that one of the side effects of that is we get diagnosed with diseases and we get prescriptions for medications. Many of those prescriptions are perfectly warranted and appropriate for diseases that we know how to treat. The problem is they kind of accumulate, and so we have quite alarming statistics about 60, 70, and 80-year-olds on 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 medications. And that's troubling because we don't always understand how all of those medications interact.
Well, we hear from those people or sometimes from their kids who are concerned about the potential for interactions. So this is something that patients may be paying attention to, but they're finding it really hard to get information.
Absolutely. And the information in many cases is simply not there. When the FDA approves a medication for use, it's based on these trials, the phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 trials for safety, efficacy, and finally a relatively big trial with thousands of patients to see if the drug works. But in order to make sure that they're evaluating the drug fairly, they often, they being the drug companies that are doing the studies, they often try to isolate the drug and try to minimize the number of other drugs that the patients are on in this study. And therefore, those studies are almost specifically designed not to look for interactions. And so then when you release the drug in the wild, so to speak, into the general market where people are using it, first of all, the numbers go from thousands to hundreds of thousands or millions of people. And second of all, we see combinations that just have not been observed in any of the formal studies. And that's why there's a phase 4 that the FDA acknowledges, which is what they call the post-marketing period, where after the drug hits the market, it really is the duty of the companies and the FDA to watch what happens. And that's hard. And that's where I don't think we're doing the greatest job to ensure the safety of the patients.
Well, Dr. Altman, there's another problem. and that is we all live in silos today, and especially if you're a health professional. What I mean by that is, there are gastroenterologists, there are dermatologists, there are neurologists, there are cardiologists. In other words, there are a lot of gists out there.
There are a lot of gists.
Those specialists. And so we go to a different doctor for the different things that ail us. So if we've got a bad blister or a rash, it's the dermatologist. If the heart is giving us a little trouble, it's the cardiologist. When our stomach acts up, it's the gastroenterologist. And each one may be very knowledgeable about the medications in their particular field, but not know so much about what other people are prescribing and how they may interact.
And in addition, the gastroenterologist may know exactly what a proton pump inhibitor like Nexium does to the GI tract, but not know very much at all about what it's doing to other parts of the body that are less interesting to gastroenterologists.
You're absolutely right. The characterizations you just drew are really spot on. And one way that I like to say this is, very often, if you have 5 diagnoses, you will get 5 medications which might be perfectly appropriate individually for each of those 5 diagnoses. But who is thinking about that ensemble of drugs together and their systemic effects? And I think you've just pointed out in your question that the answer is really nobody. And in fact, we physicians are often not trained to do that. I'm a general internist, and I'm a big believer that the general internist is supposed to be the quarterback who is looking at all of this and thinking about the potential interactions, and they do the best that they can. But let's all remember that our typical general internal medicine appointment is something like 12 minutes. It might be a half hour in a luxurious practice, and it might be 6 minutes in a little bit of a less luxurious practice. And of all those minutes, what is it, 30 seconds or a minute will be spent thinking about drugs, because we also have to think about how's the patient doing. We have to examine the patient and do the history and physical, find out what's been going on in their life. So we really don't have a system, I'm just agreeing with you, I think, for looking at the integrative effects of medications.
I'd like to throw a curveball into this equation, and that is over-the-counter stuff. So we've been talking about, okay, all the specialists, and each one of them may be prescribing a different medication and may not necessarily be familiar with the drugs that the other specialists are prescribing. But now we've got the patient, him or herself, going to the pharmacy or the health food store and buying, pain relievers for the sore shoulder, like ibuprofen or naproxen, which are available over the counter. Perhaps buying Nexium, Prilosec, or Prevacid over the counter because they don't require a prescription anymore. And then, by the way, stopping in the health food store and buying not just vitamins and minerals, but a variety of dietary supplements and herbal preparations. And you've pointed out that we don't do such a good job on drug company studies, just one drug with another drug. But if you throw in dietary supplements now, it's a giant mystery.
It really is. And to dissect a little bit what you're saying, that we have kind of 2 classes of medications that you just mentioned. One are medications that used to be by prescription, but because of a general sense of safety and low side effects, it was decided, usually later after several 15, 20 years of experience with prescription, that it's okay to make it available over the counter. So I think you mentioned Nexium and you mentioned ibuprofen, and many of those were prescription drugs in the olden days. The good news about that is, therefore, they were subject to some study, and they were subject to some quality control in how they were manufactured. So that's the first class. I'm worried about that, and I'm also worried about the second class, which are drugs that have never been kind of regulated and prescribed by physicians. And this is the world of the nutraceutical and the supplement. We know that there are many, many people who are using these, and I think you get reports of them being effective for some of those people, and I think that's great. However, as a prescriber, it's very stressful. Very often when I ask my patients, what medications are you on? They don't think of those as medications. They think of them as supplements or vitamins, and so they won't even list them. And yet we know that many of them are chemically active in the sense that they do interact with other medications and change the effects of those medications. In addition, as you may know, and I suspect your show has talked about this, sometimes the exact ingredients in those formulations is not at all clear. They might be from a plant, and sometimes the plants make a lot of the substance, and sometimes if it's a bad year, this plant doesn't make a lot. And so we sometimes don't even know what we're dealing with in terms of active chemicals. And this is not something to scrape under the rug. This is a huge market, and we know, I visit my 80-year-old father, and the shelves of his home are filled with medications that he's purchased online with all kinds of promises of his memory and his vim and verve. And we're worried about that, and I think finally there's starting to be some serious attention to that, both to figure out where is the gold in that formulary of supplements and where is the potential problems.
And that certainly is much needed.
Yes, and we have recently done a study in my laboratory, very prototype, very preliminary. Actually, a bunch of my students got together and did this kind of spontaneously. That's what the great thing about sticking a bunch of smart young people in a room together. They looked at the literature on things like St. John's wort and ginseng and other supplements. And for some of them, there is very good evidence that they interact with enzymes in the liver that are known to also interact with prescription drugs. And so they came up with kind of a hit list. This is not published yet. I wish I could share with you the details, but I can tell you that we're hoping it'll come out after peer review, a list of pairs of medications, one being a prescribed medication and one being an over-the-counter supplement, which they had a strong belief could be interacting to basically very much either increase the dose of the prescription medication, increase the effective dose. In other words, you're taking 10 milligrams, but you might be getting 20 milligrams worth of effect because of the interaction with the supplement, or the converse case where you're taking 10 milligrams, but you're really only getting 5 milligrams worth of effect because the supplement is in some way blocking. So this is, I think, a big growth area, and I do think, as you may know, the National Institutes of Health in the United States has an office of complementary and alternative medicine. I'm forgetting the exact name, but that's the idea. And I think that that's a great step forward to make sure that there is a bunch of scientists at the NIH who are specifically charged to figure out what the research path forward is for learning about these supplements and their interactions. I have to say, I'm not saying that these supplements are necessarily bad. I think there is evidence that some of them can be gentle and effective at some disorders, but they need to be studied and they need to be understood much better. And probably we need to do a little bit to make sure that we know what the ingredients are. A box of cornflakes has its ingredients. Certainly your medications that are FDA approved have the ingredients. Probably it would make sense for the supplements to have a similar label with numbers and figures and facts and statistics about what's actually in the box.
You're listening to Dr. Russ Altman, the Kenneth Fong Professor of Bioengineering, Genetics, Medicine, and Biomedical Data Science at Stanford University Medical School.
After the break, we'll find out how big data can help us learn about drug interactions.
How does the FDA learn about serious side effects?
Doctors and pharmacists are supposed to get electronic alerts about possible interactions. What happens with those warnings? A Chicago Tribune survey suggested that over 50% of pharmacies don't always warn about dangerous interactions.
How does communication break down between doctors and pharmacists and patients?
Are there patient-oriented resources to learn about drug interactions?
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon.
If you like the information you hear when you listen to The People's Pharmacy, you may also enjoy our book published by National Geographic. It's The People's Pharmacy Quick and Handy Home Remedies, available online at peoplespharmacy.com or at your favorite bookstore.
Welcome back to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Terry Graydon.
And I'm Joe Graydon. The People's Pharmacy is brought to you in part by Redix Industries, makers of utterly smooth creams and lotions that deeply moisturize to make dry skin feel soft and smooth. The number is 800-345-7339. The website is uttercream.com.
If you would like to order a CD of this show, you can call 800-732-2334. This is show number 1064. That number again, 800-732-2334. Or you can place your order online at peoplespharmacy.com.
We're talking today about the hazards of mixing medications, both prescription as well as over-the-counter.
Our guest is Dr. Russ Altman, the Kenneth Fung Professor of Bioengineering, Genetics, Medicine, and Biomedical Data Science at Stanford University Medical School.
Dr. Altman, you describe yourself as an informatics data science guy.
Yes.
And before we get into the interactions, how did you move from internal medicine to this issue of informatics and drug interactions?
So I came to Stanford University as an MD PhD student, and I had experience as an undergraduate in both biological research, but also biological research that was grounded in computation. My undergraduate research involved biological data, but also analyzing it with a computer. And I was trying to decide, I'm going to do an MD PhD. I had already been accepted to the PhD program, and the question was, what was going to be my area of specialization? And this was in the early 1980s. And to tell you the truth, to make a long story short, the introduction of the Apple Macintosh in 1984, those of us who are old enough to remember that it was a Super Bowl commercial. But I was so excited by the advances in computation in 1984 that I actually switched programs from biophysics, where I had been working, into a program at Stanford University called Medical Information Sciences. And this is the study of medical information and how to manipulate it and how to use it. That program has subsequently been renamed Biomedical Informatics, and I actually direct that program now at Stanford. But that was the obvious potential impact of computation on medicine and biology. I was very fortunate to get an inkling that might be a thing in the future. And so I switched my PhD studies, and I took computer science and statistics courses, and there was always this dual goal of helping physicians make better decisions, but also to help scientists make better discoveries and faster. And then, obviously, I was lucky, and this field really did explode, and I found myself riding this incredibly exciting wave of how can we use computation and data to improve biology and medicine. And by the way, that wave is still going, and in many ways, medicine is still far behind other industries in its use of computation and data.
Well, Dr. Altman, you mentioned the Apple television ad, and of course, one of Apple's marketing slogans has been "Think Different." So
Yes.
I guess that's what we're up to here. Tell us
Yes.
how you have thought about the FDA Adverse Event Reporting System. What the heck is it, and what can you do about it? Because most people really don't know how to use it properly.
Yes, so thanks for asking that. I should say that I have an FDA-supported center here at Stanford in collaboration with University of California at San Francisco, and so I do work with and get money from the FDA, and I think I should disclose that. In fact, I had dinner with FDA scientists who were visiting Stanford yesterday. So the FDA Adverse Event Reporting System, or FAERS as it's known, is a reporting system that can be contributed to by pharmacists, doctors, companies that make drugs, patients, nurses, and when they see an interaction that they believe should be brought to the attention of the regulatory authorities. The reports are pretty straightforward. It has all the diseases that the patient has, all the drugs that they're on, all the side effects that they experienced, and then some information about what they think might be the causative relationship. Like, of all these drugs that I were on, we think that this one caused this side effect, although that's not mandatory. It also contains some demographic information about the patient's age and sex. And I should say, there's also a written narrative where you can type in a story about what happened to the patient that leads to this report.
Well, Dr. Altman, it sounds as though the FAERS system is kind of the basket behind the slot where MedWatch is the slot.
Yes, I think that's a very fair statement. That's one of the outward-facing ways to get data in. There's also direct submission from companies who are legally mandated for drugs that they're selling to pass on the reports to the FDA. And then the FDA, remarkably, releases these quarterly onto the web. So any of us could right now, and in fact I've done this, grab a year or 5 years worth of these event reports. There's about hundreds of thousands per year and therefore millions over the last 10, 15 years. They do remove the free text portion because they're afraid that it might identify the patient. But all of those structured fields, the medications, the diseases, the diagnoses, and the side effects, those are all there. And that allows you being an interested person, either an FDA employee or a scientist or a citizen scientist, to grab that data and try to make sense of it. Now, a couple of things, because that sounds fabulous. What I've just described sounds amazing, but there are problems. It is entirely voluntary, and therefore the data that comes in can be very biased. One example would be if everybody's watching the news and on the CBS News somebody reports, or I should say or public radio, somebody reports a side effect that's been seen. We know that what will happen is people who are on that drug will say, yeah, I saw that side effect or I had that side effect, and they'll make a whole bunch of reports. And it'll look like there's been a spike in those side effects in the last week, and really it's just the bias introduced by public awareness and an increased number of reports. So that kind of thing happens, and it makes it statistically very, very challenging to separate the real signal from the fake signal. We've done some work in this area, and we do believe there is signal in the FDA adverse event reporting system, but we and others also have recognized that we simply must supplement that reporting system with other mechanisms. Those mechanisms include the Sentinel system, which is an FDA project which looks at a federation of medical records around the country and says, okay, let's watch the medical record of people who are on these drugs, and let's see if we start seeing certain side effects popping up in the general population. And then in other work that you may have seen, our lab looked at actually things like web searches, and we actually found some evidence that patients taking medications with side effects will actually start doing searches of those drugs and of those side effects, which if you have access to enough internet search logs, you can actually start to see some signals there. So FAERS is great, but it is flawed, and I think many of us believe that we have to start supplementing FAERS with the electronic medical record, with social media, and with other sources of data to try to even out that signal and make sure that what we're dealing with are real signals.
Dr. Altman, you're a bioinformatics guy, a computer guy, a guy who loves data. And when it comes to drug interactions, there are literally tens of thousands of medications on the market that doctors are prescribing, not mentioning the over-the-counter drugs and all the herbs and dietary supplements. It is humanly impossible to keep all of the bad combinations, permutations, interactions in your head. I mean, 30, 40 years ago when doctors wrote prescriptions and pharmacists dispensed them, there weren't good resources available. So it was an impossible task. And then along came computers and electronic health records and electronic prescribing. So now you and your colleagues have this marvelous system that allows for the computer to do what humans can't do, and that is check for interactions. You know, drug A plus drug B equals something really bad. Don't do it.
Yes.
The problem is,
yes,
and we've heard this repeatedly from people in the trenches, both physicians as well as PAs and pharmacists, that they get these alerts, that they get alarms, that they're told this is a dangerous combination or a problem. There are so many of these alerts that it's a little bit like the The Boy Who Cried Wolf. And after a while, both physicians and other health professionals, including pharmacists who then have to dispense these drugs, basically override or ignore a great many of those alerts. Tell us a little bit about why this computerized concept that seemed so wonderful when it was implemented 30 years ago is now a potential problem.
Yes, I mean, your question is a great one, and I love how you said it was humanly impossible to track all of the side effects, because that's exactly the issue, is that it is humanly impossible, and so we turn to computers. But as you point out, there is this phenomenon which has been called officially or unofficially alert fatigue. That is to say, fatigue from getting so many alerts that you just turn them all off or ignore them all because you're just trying to get your job done, and this could take away every moment of your day, which is supposed to be spent taking care of patients. So what do we do about alert fatigue? So one thing is that it is true that physicians cannot possibly track in their head all of the potential interactions. And therefore, we absolutely must use automated systems to help them. But then the question is the right thing to do to pop up a big yellow box in the middle of their work and say, warning, warning, there's a problem here? That simply can't be the answer, because we know from psychological studies of how people work that those kinds of interruptions are terrible in terms of the ability of a high-functioning professional to keep their train of thought and to make sure they don't make mistakes in the diagnosis and the treatment and just paying attention to the patient. So we absolutely cannot do what we're doing. And so I agree with you. And it's partly a result that our medical record systems were not really designed for effective clinical decision support. Most of our medical record systems were built for billing. Let's capture what we're doing so we can generate a fair and honest bill to the insurance company or to whoever is paying. That is very different from let's build a system so that we can seamlessly support a professional who's trying to get a job done, bringing to their attention at the right moment the potential difficulties in their decisions. That is an active research area. I don't think any physician in those trenches right now believes that those systems exist. And so I think what we're looking forward to is the next generation of electronic medical record systems that really are electronic clinical decision support systems. We have confidence that this can happen because if you look at the airline industry or other industries that are time-sensitive, high stakes, they have figured out how to not bother a pilot. They have figured out not how a surgeon in surgery can be alerted to what's going on with the patient's physiology and yet not bring that surgeon to a standstill. We simply must figure out how to take the good ideas from these other disciplines and implement them to support physicians. But I think we all agree it's not going to be a huge yellow box popping up on your screen when you're trying to write a note or trying to make a decision. That's simply too much of an interruption and just not constructive. So I don't have answers today, but I can assure you that the medical informatics community, the people who build these systems, are acutely aware of alert fatigue.
And of course, if a pharmacist catches an interaction, they may call the doctor and they will probably not get through right away. They may have to wait hours or even days or never to hear back from a physician who has written a prescription that could create a serious interaction.
You're absolutely right. And I believe that one of the potential answers here is rethinking the role of the pharmacist. I have profound respect for pharmacists. They care about medications. They know about medications. I think you could argue that the things that they know are very complementary to what physicians know. And as you know, in the past, it's been the physician making all the calls and the pharmacist executing, filling the pill box, making sure the patient is aware of the side effects. I think there's an opportunity to rethink the role of pharmacists. You can imagine a much more active pharmacist who might get a prescription from a doctor that would say, I would like this patient to be on a statin, a cholesterol medication, but I'm not sure which statin. I would like you to use information systems plus your pharmaceutical training, plus perhaps the patient's genome information and information about the other medications to recommend what the right statin would be. And in fact, go ahead and give it to them and let me know what you decided, and we will track it together. So that requires a whole new conception of the of what a pharmacist is allowed to do. But as I'm sure you're aware, there are movements, certainly in Canada and in some states in the United States, to actually allow pharmacists within well-described situations to make prescription decisions. And I don't think that's a bad thing, because I think we need to distribute some of this responsibility for getting the right drugs to the patients to the other healthcare professionals who know what they're doing. And I think pharmacists are a somewhat untapped resource there.
There are patients who would like to check up on the possibility of interactions between their medications before they start taking them. Is there any way for patients to do this?
So there are, on the web, some databases of drug interactions, and if you are a person with infinite patients, you can go and type in your drugs, and it will give you a list of the known interactions. Typically, those are alarming because they're going to tell you everything that they find, and they may not even give you a sense whether this is a common or rare interaction. And this leads me to a point that I wanted to make about your question, which is this is the kind of thing we have to look at a systems level. Of course, it's terrible if people die because of the interaction of two drugs. It would also be terrible if we spend billions of dollars making unnecessary tests for interactions that are simply not going to kill anybody. And so what our system is particularly bad about is making those trade-offs between how do we protect people but avoid bankrupting the entire health system by doing unnecessary tests that are not going to lead to anything. Whenever we use a medication, there should never be an assumption that it's 100% safe and nothing bad could happen. I tell my family members and and my patients, every prescribing decision has a cost to it, and it is just not appropriate to assume that there is any drug that is 100% safe. Every drug you're taking is a risk, and you're having to make a calculation of the benefit you expect versus the risks. The risks can be ones that are known in a database. Okay, maybe we can manage those, but there are, of course, going to be unknown risks, and that's why you should never take a medication assuming that everything's going to be fine. And we really should, as physicians and as patients, have a barrier to say, do I have confidence that given the knowledge about this drug, that the benefits are going to outweigh the risks, both known and unknown?
You're listening to Dr. Russ Altman, the Kenneth Fong Professor of Bioengineering, Genetics, Medicine, and Biomedical Data Science at Stanford University Medical School. He also has an appointment in the Department of Computer Science.
You know, this idea of alert fatigue, I suspect that most patients don't realize that their prescriber, their physician or PA or nurse practitioner may just get tired of all those alerts, and the pharmacist as well. And I think it's important for people to take more responsibility when it comes to these interaction issues. After the break, we're going to find out how two common medications, pravastatin to lower cholesterol and paroxetine for depression, interact with each other.
How did Dr. Altman and his students uncover this interaction?
What do doctors know about drug interactions?
Is there a way to make drug interaction warnings more effective?
We'll get Dr. Altman's recommendations for both health professionals and patients on spotting hazardous drug interactions.
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon. If you value the health information you get when you listen to The People's Pharmacy, consider subscribing to our email newsletter. You'll get the latest health news and information on upcoming podcasts delivered to your inbox twice a week. Look for the link at peoplespharmacy.com. Welcome back to The People's Pharmacy. I'm Terry Graydon.
And I'm Joe Graydon. The People's Pharmacy is brought to you in part by Redix Industries, makers of utterly smooth foot cream with shea butter, helping dry, cracked feet feel utterly soft and smooth. The number is 800-345-7339. The website is uttercream.com.
If you'd like to order a CD of today's show or any other People's Pharmacy broadcast, you can call 800-732-2334. Today's show is number 1064. The number again, 800-732-2334. Or find it online at peoplespharmacy.com.
Today we're talking about dangerous drug interactions with Dr. Russ Altman. He's the Kenneth Fong Professor of Bioengineering, Genetics, Medicine, and Biomedical Data Science at Stanford University Medical School.
Dr. Altman, you gave a TED Talk in which you described a student of yours making the discovery that two very commonly prescribed medications, pravastatin, which is a statin to lower cholesterol, and paroxetine, which is an antidepressant drug, both of them very, very commonly prescribed, interact in a way that hadn't been described before. How did he do that research, and what did he find?
It's a great data story and a great story about a young student, finding his special gift. So we were interested in these drug interactions, and we were interested in this FAERS database that we talked about earlier. And I said to Nick, really what we don't understand are interactions, and I wonder if we can get any information about FAERS. And so he went off and he wrote a program that could look at a single medication and tell you if it was altering glucose based on the side effects it created. We all know that when your glucose goes up, there's certain symptoms that become more likely. You might urinate more, you might have some fatigue. There's a series of symptoms. So he used some of the latest methods in what we call machine learning. It's a data science technique that looks at large numbers of drugs, and he had a list of drugs that he knew changed glucose. And he said, do I see a pattern in those drugs that is repeated? And he did. He found about 7 or 8 side effects that were always listed in FAERS, not always, but very frequently listed in FAERS whenever you were taking one of these known drugs that increases glucose. And so he came in, as I say in the TED Talk, he was very proud of himself, but I said, Nick, physicians are all trained to know about those drugs. This is Nick Tatnetti. He's now a professor at Columbia University. He said, yes, I know that, Russ, but what about if I look at pairs of drugs that are not typically associated with glucose and I see the same signal? And I said, well, that would be interesting. And so he presented me a list of these drugs that together looked just like drugs that increase glucose, even though individually they didn't. So because they were individually unrelated to glucose, it suggested that there was an interaction between the two drugs, and you needed to have both of them on board in order to have this effect. And we saw this signal in FAERS, and we were excited, but I said, but we really need to figure out a way to validate this. And so we went to the electronic medical record at Stanford, and we looked for people who had been on one of these two drugs and had a glucose measured, and then had the second drug prescribed and had another glucose measured. And we looked at those glucoses, and we saw that they were, in a statistically significant way, the glucoses were going up after receiving the second of those two medications. And by the way, either one could be first. We pooled the data, so you could have either one, pravastatin or paroxetine first, and then you would get the other one second, and then we saw a consistent trend. But the numbers were small, so even though it was statistically significant, it was borderline. We called friends at Harvard and Vanderbilt, and we said, could you please look in your medical records, which they've also assembled for research purposes, and see if you see a similar trend. And they all came back within a week or two and saw a similar trend. So we wrote this paper saying, look, these two drugs together seem to be increasing glucose. It actually was a bigger effect in people with diabetes. The glucose was going up about 15 to 20 milligrams per deciliter, so like from 90 to 110 or 115 in non-diabetics, but it was going up 60 milligrams per deciliter in diabetics, which is quite significant. And so we wrote this paper, and then Nick did something. He's a data scientist, but he realized that some experimental data might be helpful, so he actually fed these drugs to mice and then measured their blood glucose and saw the same effect in mice. And so we published that paper, and it was a great example of a number of things, but the hypothesis came from the FDA database. I wouldn't say at that point it was at all proven, but it gave us a hint of what might be true, which allowed us to go to one medical record database, see a little bit of more of a hint, and then go to two others, so that we then really started to believe it. And then finally, we did a very focused experiment with the mice to show that it really did happen in a model organism. So it was a good example of data science leading the way so that you can do a very focused experiment and discover a potential interaction. Now, I must say, it was very interesting. The FDA talked to me and said, Russ, our methods don't replicate your results. And I said, well, that doesn't surprise me because we invented new methods to make this discovery. And so the FDA said, well, we understand you have a new method, but it's new. It's never been used before. We really can't take action based on an unvalidated method. And I really do understand the quandary that they're in, even though I thought it was very compelling, and obviously the peer reviewers who reviewed our paper also thought it was pretty compelling. It used methods that were not kind of validated by the FDA, and the FDA's methods aren't able to see that signal. In fact, in the FAERS, there are no reports where somebody says, I'm on paroxetine and pravastatin, and I had a high sugar. Zero. Millions of reports, we weren't able to find any. Because remember, the way we found the signal was indirectly through the side effects associated with hyperglycemia, not a direct report of hyperglycemia. That is a novel kind of approach that is not used by the FDA, and therefore it was kind of out of their range of experience. So we've been trying to work with them to figure out how can we take these new methods and validate them so that the FDA can appropriately use them when they think it's the right thing to do.
Well, Dr. Altman, does that mean that doctors don't know now that if they prescribe pravastatin and paroxetine together to a person who has diabetes, that their blood sugar will be much harder to control?
That is correct. The FDA in my conversations with them, said, well, the thing we would do is what we call a black box warning, which would say, warning, do not use these two drugs together. We're not going to do that until your methods are validated more and we adopt them as qualified procedures for evaluating side effects. So as of now, there is no warning to physicians. The only way a physician might consider this is if they happen to read our paper and believe it. And so that's where we stand today.
Dr. Altman, I'd like to get very specific about drug interaction warnings. We've stumbled across some Canadian research that suggests when physicians prescribe a category of blood pressure medications called ACE inhibitors, they're probably the most popular blood pressure pills in the world today, together with a very popular antibiotic called cotrimoxazole, sold once upon a time as Bactrim or Septra. That combination can lead to something called hyperkalemia. As a physician, you know that's very high potassium levels. And when potassium levels get way high, it can lead to something really bad called cardiac arrest, which is not compatible with life. Now, a lot of the databases suggest that this is a modest interaction and that physicians should monitor potassium levels. The trouble is, from what we've discovered, it can come on very suddenly. So if you send a patient home with these two drugs together, within a couple of days or weeks, they could end up literally in a life-threatening situation where there may not have been time to get those potassium levels. So both physicians and pharmacists who are monitoring their computer screens might not realize that that combination, which is prescribed to literally millions of people every year, could be life-threatening. I guess the point is data in, data out. If it's not good, how would a doctor or a pharmacist know that this could be a deadly interaction?
Yes, that's a great example. I'm not familiar with that specific study, although I'm not surprised to hear it because it sounds like a typical interaction. As you know, the ACE inhibitors are associated with hyperkalemia, high potassium, even as a baseline side effect. And so it wouldn't be surprising at all if there are some medications that exacerbate that. And so you're right. In typical practice, when we start somebody on an ACE inhibitor, we might make one or two checks of the potassium early on, and maybe annually, although that would be, I think, exceptional, just to make sure everything is okay. But then we don't think of it again when there are changes in the other medications. So you have a urinary tract infection, you get some of clotrimazole, and next thing you know, that maybe your potassium goes up. This really goes back to our discussion of, FDA could put a black box warning there. Maybe the pharmacist would be aware of it. The physician might be aware of it for about 10 seconds and then would forget about it because there's just too much in a physician's life. Probably that would happen with the pharmacist too. I think the only hope is to have appropriate clinical decision support. The problem is, as we said before, nobody wants a big yellow box in their face. So what is the appropriate way? In this case, the appropriate way would be when the prescription of the clotrimazole is made, on top of the baseline use of an ACE inhibitor, which would, I think, be by far the most common situation, there needs to be an alert, probably to the pharmacist, not to the physician, saying this might not be a good idea. And then the pharmacist could use their judgment to either withhold giving the clotrimazole or say, I'm only going to give this to you if I have some evidence that somebody is following up on your potassium in the next 24 to 48 hours, not next year. That's a complicated intervention that the system is not really set up to make right now. And which is why, if this is a true interaction, it probably, as you said, is happening tens of thousands of times a year, and we're probably just lucky if only a few people are suffering.
Dr. Altman, we've been talking about dangerous and sometimes even deadly drug interactions, and we tend to think of those as coming on suddenly. So somebody might have their potassium level go up really high if they're taking a drug like lisinopril together with a drug like clotrimazole, and at some point it could reach a level that could literally cause cardiac arrhythmias and then ultimately cardiac arrest. So that's a pretty fast interaction and one that needs to be monitored pretty carefully. What we haven't talked about are interactions that can come on very gradually over a period of months or even years. There's a category of medicines called anticholinergic drugs. I'm sure you're quite familiar with them. They're drugs that, for example, control motion sickness like transderm scope, scopolamine, or drugs for overactive bladder that help prevent incontinence. But there are literally scores, if not hundreds of drugs that are anticholinergic, and we've now learned that when you put together a bunch of different kinds of anticholinergic drugs, that it may affect mental functioning, that people may be at higher risk for Alzheimer's disease. My guess is that's not the sort of thing that people would normally look at, and I suspect that a lot of patients would like to protect themselves. Can you think of any way that they might be able to do that, how they might find out if their medication had anticholinergic activity and where the danger might be?
So, yes, you've just pointed out one of the hardest things to do is any kind of chronic long-term effect is going to be very difficult to measure and to prove. I don't have great ideas about that. I'm somewhat optimistic that as our electronic medical record infrastructure gets embedded and we get hundreds of years of experience. Most electronic medical records are only 20 years old. We need to have them be around another 50 or 60 years so we have entire lifetimes contained within them. Once we have entire lifetimes, then we can look and say, oh, people who were exposed to these classes of drugs have a higher rate of, symptom X or disease Y. Now that generates a hypothesis that we can then try to study. So that's going to be one of the good long-term benefits of keeping track of every patient. I'm sure you know that the United States NIH has announced the Precision Medicine Initiative, or PMI, which will follow a cohort of 1 million Americans over their lifetime for disease risk and other health indicators. That's the kind of discovery we'll be able to make once that cohort has been followed for 30, 40, 50 years. As of today, those kind of hypotheses are incredibly difficult to evaluate because we simply don't have the data about who's been exposed to what for the last 20 or 30 years.
Dr. Altman, what recommendations do you have for health professionals and for patients?
As I alluded to earlier, I think that we have to have a higher barrier to using medications. too often it's the way to end the interaction with a patient. It's been nice to see you. I look forward to seeing you again in 6 months. And we have this weird thing where, and I'm going to end this interaction by giving you this little piece of paper with a prescription to show that I care about you and that I'm a good doctor. And that just is not acceptable. We can't have pills be the currency of medical care. And so I would encourage both physicians and patients to really be somewhat, I would say, skeptical about the need for any medication. And I think you should always be willing to stop and say, what are the benefits of this medication? What are the alternatives? And what are the consequences if I don't take a medication? Physicians should be able to tell you why they're making a prescription and why they feel that the known benefits outweigh the risks, both known and unknown. And I think that that would move us towards a more skeptical use of medications. They can be miraculous, but they are not for free in terms of their side effects. And so we should just be more vigilant about their use. And it shouldn't be the currency of a visit, and it shouldn't be a sign that your doctor cares about you that they give you a prescription.
Dr. Russ Altman, thank you so much for talking with us on the People's Pharmacy today.
Thanks very much.
You've been listening to Dr. Russ Altman. He's the Kenneth Fong Professor of Bioengineering, Genetics, Medicine, and Biomedical Data Science at Stanford University Medical School. He also holds a courtesy appointment in the Department of Computer Science. You'll find links to his papers and talks on our website, peoplespharmacy.com, where you'll also find a link to the study regarding the Chicago Tribune research on pharmacy-drug interaction overrides. It suggests that there are huge holes in the safety net when you go to the pharmacy and you get a prescription for more than one medicine.
It seems that patients might need to be protecting themselves, since more than half of these pharmacies went ahead and dispensed 2 incompatible medications.
Not just incompatible. Some of these pairs were actually deadly drug interactions, and patients weren't even warned. So if you'd like to learn more, visit the website peoplespharmacy.com.
Lynn Siegel produced today's show. Al Wadarski is the engineer. Dave Graydon edits our interviews.
The People's Pharmacy is produced at the studios of North Carolina Public Radio, WUNC.
The People's Pharmacy theme music is by B.J. Liederman.
The People's Pharmacy is made possible in part by Redix Industries, makers of Utterly Smooth Extra Care 20 Cream. With 20% urea for extra skin protection. The number is 800-345-7339. The website is uttercream.com.
If you'd like to purchase a CD of today's show or any other People's Pharmacy broadcast, you can call 800-732-2334. Today's show is number 1064. The number again, 800-732-2334. Find it online at peoplespharmacy.com.
And when you visit our site, you can check out information on prescription drugs, herbal medicines, and home remedies. Share your thoughts on today's show. We'd love to have your feedback. Have you ever experienced a drug interaction?
When you go to the website, you could also sign up for our free online newsletter or the free podcast of the show. That way, you can listen at your own convenience or share it with a friend. It's all there at peoplespharmacy.com.
In Durham, North Carolina, I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. Thank you so much for listening. Please join us again next week.
We hope you enjoyed this podcast. If so, please consider taking a minute to write a review on iTunes. And thanks for listening to The People's Pharmacy.